Hello, everyone. This is number 17 in my ongoing YouTube series dealing with interpretations of Bible prophecy through the ages. And if you've been following this, you should be saying right now, wait a minute, what happened to number 16? Because the last one I recorded was 15, and now I've jumped to 17. So let me explain something. I'll share my screen here with you. And I'll show you where the mystery 16 is actually found. What I do occasionally, I've done it, this is the second time, I've taken a video that I have previously made because I've talked a lot about Bible prophecy and apocalypticism and so forth on my channel over the past 2 years. And I've repurposed it and made it part of this series. And this, as you can see, sharing the screen here, is number 16. I've numbered it now and put it as part of the series. And it's called When Jerusalem Means Jerusalem, Prophecy Interpretation in the 21st Century. Now, this was a lecture that I did in 2017 in Jerusalem. It was at a conference, an academic conference, called the Center for Studies on New Religions. It was at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, a wonderful place in Jerusalem that hosted it. And the opening session was called Holy City Jerusalem and New Religious Movements. So I gave this lecture, and it basically has to do with prophecy beliefs about Jerusalem. So I thought it would be useful to include it. And if you've already seen it, maybe rewatch it. I think most of you who are listening to this probably have never seen it. After you have a couple hundred videos up on your channel, as I do, I try to organize things under categories, as you can see here, looking at my YouTube page. But then you go to some of these categories and there's a lot of things. Here's 28 videos right here and 47 under Tabor lectures and so forth. So you can get lost pretty quickly unless you're a real Tabor video devotee, which some of you are, I'm thankful to say. So this one I'm considering as real background for what I'm going to say today in the current video, number 17. So what I want to cover today will probably surprise many of you. I've been holding up the Harper-Collins Bible here. This is a critical historical edition of the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Apocrypha with maps. It's a wonderful production, lots of notes, and I highly recommend it. And I'll put the link in the description. This, I went and retrieved it from my office yesterday, my library office. You can see the spine is the Holy Bible, and it's King James Version. It's Oxford, which is one of the best Bible makers. But this is the Scofield Bible, the old Scofield Bible, published in 1909, republished in 1917, republished again in 1945, right at the end of World War II, and still one of the favorite Bibles of many evangelical Christian groups that are very much into interpreting Bible prophecy. For example, I listened yesterday to a video from John Hagee, the minister in San Antonio, Texas, my hometown. He's very well known. He's the one who started Christians United for Israel. In the earlier episodes of this series, I talked about dispensationalism and John Darby and the Scofield Bible. That's what this is. And what makes this unique, because it's just a King James version of the Bible, are the notes. And what I'm going to suggest in this particular lecture that is surprising, I think, to people, is that the approach of this Bible and the approach of a fundamentalist King James Version Scofield Bible have some real commonalities when it comes to Bible prophecy. And it's hinted at and covered somewhat in that previous lecture that I gave in Jerusalem in 2017. So if you listen to that first, you'll be caught up on some of that, and I'll repeat some of it. Now, how could they be similar at all? One would say that the Bible is perfectly inspired. It's dictated practically by God or through the influence of the Holy Spirit. There's not one mistake in it. This Bible even has Ussher's chronology. If you open Genesis 1, it says 404 BC, using the old chronology of Ussher, and it considers that the creation of the world. Most respectable scholars would not want this even in their office, and here I have brought it to mine. The lecture called When Jerusalem Meets Jerusalem has to do with the idea that in the 20th century and the late 19th century, various fundamentalist Christian believers and scholars and teachers began to develop the idea that had been developed particularly by John Darby. And I cover that in the 2017 lecture. I'm not going to go into that today. But the essential idea is that if you're reading in the Hebrew Bible prophets and you come across a reference to Israel or Jerusalem, that Israel means Israel. It means the Jewish people. It means the northern and southern tribes of Israel that have been scattered through the world. And you read it literally, as people call it. So if there's a passage, as we covered before, Zechariah 14, about all the armies of the world coming against Jerusalem and being utterly defeated, you read that as referring to Jerusalem. And those who interpret it as applying to today, as many would, and certainly those who follow the general interpretations of this Darbyite Scofield Bible dispensationalism, like John Hagee, would say it's the city today. And he, of course, thinks the time is very, very near. I caught a video of his, and I might talk about it later in a later episode. He made it about 10 months ago before the war broke out, 3 weeks ago, after the Hamas massacre on October 7th. But he was talking about the coming war in Jerusalem and so forth, based on his interpretation of Bible prophecy, as we say, taken literally. Well, an academic historical Bible like this also would say Jerusalem means Jerusalem, meaning when the author wrote it, it was not allegorical, it was not spiritual, it wasn't talking about the church, it wasn't talking about anything but Jerusalem. Now, whether it was accurate or whether it was speculative or when it's predictive, whether it's ever been fulfilled, is part of what this series has been exploring since the very first episode. And we've gone through the prophecies of Daniel, and we've gone through the 10 great messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Bible. And I've taken what I would call a descriptive, analytical, historical, critical approach. When were these written? What do they say? What does the author or the authors intend by what they say? You see? And a conservative evangelical Christian today, and there are millions of them, particularly in the United States and Europe, who are reading Bible prophecy, they're also reading it very literally. The difference is that a scholar would be looking at the past and trying to understand what the authors had in mind, whereas a modern interpreter would be looking at the past and these prophecies and seeing it as a roadmap to the future. And in some cases, an exact, precise roadmap to the future. So what happens in the late 19th, early 20th century is people begin to open the Bible and read it in this literal way again. you get this opportunity to replay the prophecies that had kind of been set aside in the late Second Temple period. When the Romans conquered Jerusalem and following the Bar Kokhba revolt, there's no chance of any prophecies being fulfilled literally because there was no nation of Israel and Jerusalem was occupied by the Romans. And then the Byzantine Christian period and the Muslims in the 7th century, and then the Crusades, and then the Ottoman Turks, and so forth, on down to the 19th century at the end of the century. So what I point out in my lecture, the previous lecture from 2017, is that beginning in the late 19th and early 20th century, you get a series of events that change everything in terms of interpretations of Bible prophecy through the ages. When the British expelled the Ottoman Turks from the Holy Land, and Jerusalem is now under the sovereignty of the British, and the region in general is divided up by the Allies after World War I. You go to 1947, 1948, with the UN partition plan and the Declaration of Independence and the formation of the State of Israel. There's a passage in Isaiah, can a nation be born in a day? And it's prophetically talking about Israel being reestablished. You can see why people would read that and say this is happening. 1967 was a huge event for interpreters of Bible prophecy, because once more, for the first time since the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, it fell into Jewish hands. And the Jews saw it as liberation, and many others saw it as occupation of Arab territory. One thing that's seldom pointed out, historically speaking, is that Jews were always in the Holy Land. And in fact, in the Ottoman census of 1900, this is even in Wikipedia, the numbers, there are more Jews in the city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, than there are Muslims or Christians. And that lasts right up until the 1940s. So to call Jerusalem a Muslim city would not actually be true in terms of population. It was true in terms of control, because the Turks were in control. Jews were allowed, I think, 2 days a week to go to the Western Wall and pray, but they were restricted. It was a very small area. But that all changed at the end of the first Arab-Israeli War, as it's usually called, 1948, because Jordan took control of that area and all the Jews were expelled to the west. And so Jerusalem literally became Judenrein, and the Jewish quarter was largely destroyed, and some of the major historic synagogues, like where Maimonides had worshipped, were blown up and destroyed. And of course, today it's all been rebuilt. As I'm making this video, the last day of October 2023, we're over 3 weeks into this war of Israel against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and all the attendant associations with that, with the Arab nations meeting, the UN Security Council, and so on. So lots of people who follow Bible prophecy have really looked up and opened their eyes and began to read these prophecies again. And I've been talking about that for the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I hope the point is clear to everyone. When the area of the Holy Land in Jerusalem and the Middle East begins to have an arrangement and a setup where Jews are back, where Jerusalem is under Jewish control, where the nations of the world are, quote, gathered against Jerusalem. For example, at the United Nations Security Council this week, where only a couple of nations spoke up in behalf of Israel. But I want to contrast that with a very opposite view. And it's held by millions and millions of Christians who do not look at Bible prophecies in that literal way, And they follow what sometimes is called a spiritual or allegorical interpretation. In other words, Jerusalem doesn't mean Jerusalem. It just means the people of God throughout history. And the nations gathering against Jerusalem could have many fulfillments any time that Christians have been persecuted or the forces of evil have come against the forces of good. So you have this kind of generic universalizing of Bible prophecy. Now, you can trace that particularly to St. Augustine in the City of God, where he begins to talk about the allegory of these different terms and ideas. The temple is no longer the literal temple in Jerusalem. The Antichrist, as he's usually called today, is no longer a final evil ruler that is going to appear soon and be interviewed on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or something like that and hold press conferences. But rather, these terms can be used to apply very generically to all sorts of things. So that was Augustine. The roots of that, though, are really in the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul lived in the 50 CE. So that's before the destruction of the temple. And he did pioneer a way to begin to interpret some of these prophecies less literally. He begins to say things like, there's an earthly Jerusalem, but there's also a heavenly Jerusalem that he tells his Gentile believers is the mother of us all. And he begins to use those allegories, and he even, in the book of Galatians, calls it an allegory, meaning not a literal interpretation, but a kind of typological interpretation is the way we often refer to it. Now, that gets picked up by the church very, very widely. And throughout church history with the church fathers and the Middle Ages, there were very few readers of these Bible prophecies that were reading them and thinking that they're talking about geopolitical events in the Middle East at the end of the age. There were times when certain kinds of apocalyptic views would almost like flare up. But more often than not, these prophecies were applied non-literally or symbolically or generically. This view is often called a preterist view when it's applied to the book of Revelation. Now, historians also take a preterist view. Let's take the book of Revelation for an example. If I'm interpreting the book of Revelation, I think it all applies to the past, not to the future. I think it fundamentally was written during the time of Nero and Domitian and those emperors before, during, and after the destruction of Jerusalem. I take a Schweitzerian view, following Albert Schweitzer, that the early followers of Jesus, including Jesus himself, believed incorrectly that they were at the end of the age, and the different predictions that they made and the interpretations they made failed to come about. For me, that's fairly bottom line. But there's also begun to develop in the 20th century and now the 21st century an adaptation of that classic Christian spiritualizing view that the church is the kingdom, that the kingdom of God did come on earth, that Jesus does rule, that he's the Messiah, that he's sitting in heaven, and Jerusalem above is what everybody's waiting for, not Jerusalem below. And the political events in the Middle East would have nothing to do with anything mentioned in the Hebrew prophets. And this is usually referred to as a full preterist view. I've had students over the years that have come up to me and said, well, Dr. Tabor, you say all these prophecies failed to happen in your apocalypticism course, but I'm a full preterist and I think they all happened. And if you're a really full preterist, you would even read passages like 1 Thessalonians 4, where Paul describes the coming or parousia of Jesus of Nazareth, of the dead being raised incorruptible and the living rising to meet Jesus in the air in the clouds of heaven, and 1 Corinthians 15, the transformation of the body, and so forth, you would interpret that as all fulfilled, that it's actually happened, that Christians now who have died are sitting in heavenly places, and even living Christians, in effect, are already living in the kingdom. Now, I'm convinced that this form of interpretation, the full preterist view, is really a child of apologetics. In other words, it's an attempt to say, oh, you think all of this hasn't happened. Actually, it's all happened. And then if you begin naming things and ticking them off, going through Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21, all fulfilled. Check it off. Everything's been fulfilled. The Son of Man did come in the clouds of heaven. The church is the kingdom. The people of God are the new Israel. And the new Torah, or the new covenant, is actually the New Testament and spiritual believers in the church. And the church, therefore, replaces Israel. So nothing has failed. So you can see the appeal of that interpretation. It's essentially an attempt to save the day for prophecies that seem to have never happened. And it applies to the Hebrew Bible just as well. Now, the problem with that is lots of the things that the Messiah is supposed to do, he hasn't done. Even if Jesus is the Messiah and he's sitting on a throne in heaven and he's controlling all the affairs of the world, when you read Daniel 2 or Daniel 7, it just doesn't sound like that's happening. It sounds like we're still in a fully corruptible world, a world of sin and death, as Paul calls it, and the transformation hasn't come. And I don't know how anyone could read the Apostle Paul and try to make him a so-called full preterist. Yes, he uses allegories for Jerusalem above, but that's a view common even at Qumran with the Dead Sea Scroll group, other Jewish groups that do believe that the heavens somehow mirror. There's a temple in heaven and a temple on earth. There's Jerusalem above and Jerusalem below. But that has nothing to do with what Paul expected to come. He's reading Daniel like all the other interpreters of the first century, and he's expecting very literal things to happen. Believe me, when the Emperor Caligula tried to order his statue to be put up in the temple at Jerusalem in the year 41 CE, Paul was looking at that. He was expecting this man of sin, as he calls him, to come and sit in the temple of God. And he says in 2 Thessalonians, which many scholars don't think is fully authentically Paul, but it certainly reflects the Pauline school or the Pauline point of view, that even the day of the Lord can't come yet until this man of sin comes and sits in the temple of God and says he is God. So what you end up with basically are these two views. And they have all kinds of modifications. And one of the modifications of a historical reading of those texts in a kind of classic preterist view would be this continuous historical view, that every generation can pick up the prophecies of the Bible, particularly the book of Revelation, and find the spiritual realities, the wars between good and evil going on in their own day and time. But that would be very different from a futurist view. So my point in this particular video is just to draw that out a little bit and to make the kind of startling assertion, I think, that the Scofield Bible, the most conservative interpretation that you could get among fundamentalist Christians that are very involved in interpreting Bible prophecy for our own day, are strange bedfellows, as we say, with the historical critical people. Because the historical critical people also look at the same text and they think that the authors expected them to literally happen before their eyes. They just don't think they happened. And I suppose if you pressed a historical critical reader, that person would have to say, I guess the door is open for them to happen in the future, but the chronology clearly is hard to stretch out. I mean, how long can you stretch 490 years of Daniel 9? What someone like John Hagee would say, and he does say it in his recent video, is the prophetic clock stops in 70 CE, and then it begins ticking again in 1917, when the British take over the Holy Land from the Ottoman Turks, and the Jews begin streaming more back into Israel. And then you can have all of these prophecies fulfilled about in the last days, God will call his people from the ends of the earth, and they'll come back to the land and so forth. Now, there's kind of a double loop to this sort of thing, because people can read the prophecies and use that as an inspiration for fulfilling them, right? In other words, if God said the Jews are going to come back to Israel, and a final evil ruler is going to come, and the temple is going to get rebuilt, and there's going to be a final period of 7 years and a great tribulation. And of course, the standard view is that the Christians will be taken away to heaven right before the final years begin. And then there's a countdown with all kinds of things happening and so forth. There can be a little element of self-fulfillment there. What if somebody wants that to happen very badly, and they decide to take it into their own hands, as Dennis Rohan did in the 1960s? You can look him up if you don't remember him. He was a apocalyptic Christian believer, and he thought he would try to help prophecy along by destroying the Alaska Mosque. And he's even used today by Muslims to talk about how Christian forces, he was an American, would like to see that mosque threatened and destroyed, or the Dome of the Rock torn down so the temple, the Jewish temple, can be rebuilt. So you see how these texts today have a very complex kind of possible history and interpretation. Everything from it's all happened before, it's all fulfilled, don't even worry about it, and whatever's happening in the Middle East is absolutely irrelevant, anything prophetically in the Bible, to those who think it's very near, and then some who even think I'd like to help it along a little bit. So basically, that's what I wanted to do today, is just to begin to talk about how these parameters of these different interpretations are coming together. And in the future, I'll explore each one in more detail. We've still got some texts we need to look at. I've got some more of these floating prophecies, but because of all the things going on in the Middle East right now, and this kind of renaissance of Bible prophecy and interpretations that's just going crazy on the internet, I wanted to lay out a basic introduction. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you next time.